The Pipe That Broke the Lake, a tale of ego and ecosystems. The sun had barely crested over Lakeview Estates when a wildlife rescue van careened down a gravel road, its tires screaming against the loose stones. With a sickening crunch, it slammed into a pine tree, the impact echoing across the quiet morning. Inside, a ranger named Emily staggered out, her hands trembling as she clutched a cooler packed with sedated frogs and endangered creatures now twitching from heat stress. The marsh they called home, fed by a steady stream from Lake Serenity, had turned to cracked mud overnight. The pump station downstream, meant to keep their habitat alive, had sputtered to a halt. Just 12 hours ago, water had flowed freely. Emily stared at the dry culvert, her heart pounding, unaware that a woman named Deborah, armed with a contractor's invoice and a vendetta against ugly pipes, had just ignited an environmental crisis that would ripple far beyond her manicured backyard. In the serene neighborhood of Lakeview Estates, where retirees sipped coffee on wraparound porches and Canada geese glided across the lake, life moved at a predictable pace. The community, nestled in upstate New York, was a haven for those who'd traded city bustle for lakefront tranquility. But beneath the surface of HOA meetings and garden tours, tensions simmered, petty grudges over fence heights, mailbox colors, and for one resident, a pipe that dared to exist near her property line. Tom Harper, a 58-year-old widower, stood in his garage that morning, checking the pressure gauges on a water line he'd installed 5 years ago. A contract with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service tasked him with maintaining a 2-mile pipeline from Lake Serenity to a federal wildlife refuge downstream. It wasn't flashy work most neighbors didn't even know it existed, but to Tom, it was a calling. The water sustained a delicate ecosystem of herons, salamanders, and rare frogs, species that clung to survival because of his quiet diligence. To him, the pipe wasn't just PVC and steel. It was a lifeline for creatures that couldn't speak for themselves. That peace was shattered when a chainsaw's whine cut through the morning air. Tom set his coffee down, frowning. He figured it was a landscaper trimming hedges, a common sound in Lakeview. But as he jogged to the edge of his property, his stomach lurched. There, by the lake's rocky shore, stood Deborah Mitchell, the HOA president, in a teal tracksuit and oversized sunglasses. She waved her arms like a conductor, directing a crew digging a trench right where Tom's pipe ran underground. Her blonde hair bounced as she pointed at a blue PVC pipe, now exposed like a bone in the dirt. One of the workers, a young man in a sweat-stained shirt, shouted over the noise, asking if the pipe was live. Deborah laughed, brushing him off. "It's just some old junk from before the houses went up," she said, her voice dripping with certainty. "Cut it." Tom sprinted forward, yelling, but he was too late. The saw's teeth sank into the plastic, and a geyser of lake water erupted, soaking the worker and splattering Deborah's outfit with mud. She shrieked not in horror, but in fury that her sneakers were ruined. By the time Tom reached the scene, the pipe lay in 2 mangled pieces, water trickling out as the pressure plummeted. He dropped to his knees, inspecting the damage. The cut wasn't clean. The pipe was crushed, shards of plastic scattered in the mud. This wasn't a quick fix, it would need a full replacement, permits, and weeks of work. Deborah, arms crossed, her voice syrupy with fake concern, asked why he had a pipe, cluttering her shoreline. Tom's jaw clenched. He explained, voice steady but tight, that the pipe was a legal installation, contracted by the federal government, in place long before she'd bought her lakefront lot 2 years ago. Tampering with it wasn't just a nuisance site, violated federal law. Deborah smirked, delivering a line that burned into Tom's memory. "If the frogs need water, they can buy it at Costco like the rest of us." She turned and strutted away, leaving her contractor to mumble an apology. However, the damage was already done, and the consequences were spiraling out of control. Within hours, Tom's phone buzzed with frantic calls. First, a ranger from the refuge reported that their water intake had dropped to zero, with only a half-day's backup supply. Then a biologist, Dr. Laura Chun, called in a panic. The sudden drought was disrupting the frogs' breeding season, triggering chaotic migrations that could spread disease or wipe out the population. These weren't backyard toads, their survival hinged on precise hydration, and without it, the refuge faced an ecological collapse. Tom drove to the broken pipe, staring at the trench Deborah had left like a wound in the earth. Mud crusted around the break, and the surrounding soil drank up the last drops of water. Fixing this would take more than tools. It would take a fight. Back home, Tom found a black SUV parked outside his garage. A man in a green jacket leaned against it, sunglasses low on his nose. He introduced himself as Federal Wildlife Agent Daniel Reed, his tone clipped and serious. "Your name's on the maintenance contract," Reed said. "What happened?" Tom recounted Deborah's actions, her dismissal of the pipe's purpose, and the witnesses who'd seen it all. Reed's face hardened. "She cut it herself?" he asked. Tom nodded. "In front of everyone." Reed didn't smile. He pulled out a notebook and started writing. What began as a neighborly dispute had now escalated into a federal investigation. Reed warned that the water disruption threatened endangered species, potentially a criminal act depending on what they uncovered. Tom offered to help with repairs, and Reed agreed to coordinate. They shook hands, bound by a shared urgency. That evening, as Tom prepared to meet a restoration contractor, he passed Deborah's house. She'd thrown a party canopies, catered sliders, and HOA members clinking wine glasses to celebrate her shoreline cleanup. Deborah spotted Tom and raised her glass in a mock toast, asking if he needed a towel to dry off from earlier. Her laughter grated like sandpaper. Tom kept walking. He knew something she didn't. By morning, federal agents would arrive with warrants. That night, at the wildlife refuge, biologists worked frantically, transferring frogs into emergency tubs with oxygenated water. The community slept, oblivious to the crisis unfolding beyond their pristine lawns. Deborah didn't yet grasp that her impulsive act had set off a chain reaction that could bring federal charges, dismantle the HOA, and turn her backyard into a protected zone. But Tom knew. He sat at his desk, drafting an email to the Fish and Wildlife Service, outlining the violation and requesting immediate action. This wasn't about revenge, it was about protecting what mattered. The next morning, Lakeview Estates woke to an unfamiliar sound, the low rumble of a government SUV rolling down Maple Drive. Tom stood on his porch, coffee in hand, watching his agent Reed step out, now in a black polo with a badge glinting on his belt. Deborah emerged from her house in a silk robe, still in party host mode, and approached Reed with a smile, asking if he was there to check her landscaping permit. Reed's expression didn't flicker. He introduced himself as a federal agent and asked her to answer questions about the pipe. Deborah laughed, insisting it was abandoned trash she had every right to remove. Reed asked if she'd contacted utilities or surveyed the land before digging. She shrugged. "It's my property. I decide what stays." Reed's pen moved across his notebook. He informed her that the pipe was part of a federally contracted system supplying a protected habitat. Deborah's smile faltered. "You're joking," she said. He wasn't. By afternoon, she'd called an emergency HOA meeting, not to apologize, but to push a motion banning unapproved utility lines along the shore. Tom sat in the back, silent, as she spun the pipe as an eyesore and a hazard. Several board members, loyal to her, nodded, more worried about property values than federal law. When Tom's turn came, he didn't argue. He handed the board chair a copy of his federal contract and a folder of emails he'd sent over the years, warning the HOA about the pipe's importance. All ignored. The room went quiet as the chair read the documents. One member asked if the HOA could be liable. Tom nodded. "Especially if you knew and did nothing." Deborah tried to claim he'd never warned anyone, but a neighbor, a retired teacher named Carl, spoke up. "I remember those emails," he said. Another admitted to hearing Deborah joke about cutting red tape at a cocktail party. Her grip on the room began to slip. That night, Tom got a call from Deborah's husband, Greg. His voice was strained, like a man caught in a storm he didn't start. He asked to meet privately by the lake, under a boat shed where no one would hear. Greg confessed that Deborah had known about the pipe when they bought the house. He'd shown her the property plans and warned her not to touch it, but she was obsessed with her perfect shoreline. She'd used HOA funds to hire the contractor, burying the cost in a landscaping budget. Tom listened, recording the conversation on his phone not out of spite, but as insurance. The next day, a courier delivered a letter from the HOA, signed by Deborah, suspending Tom's lake access for non-compliance with aesthetic standards. He laughed at the absurdity. It was a desperate move, and it would backfire. Tom took the letter to Agent Reed, who added it to the case file. The investigation was now probing obstruction, retaliation, and misuse of HOA funds. As Reed and another agent photographed the damaged pipe and trench, Deborah posed for Instagram nearby, a glass of cider in hand, captioning her post, "Lake Life Forever." The irony was stark. Downstream, the refuge scrambled with water trucks and round-the-clock monitoring, fighting to save an ecosystem she'd nearly destroyed. The morning mist still clung to Lake Serenity when a tiny, mottled frog hopped onto Deborah Mitchell's pristine koi pond path. Its sudden appearance sent her stumbling down her deck stairs, her scream piercing the quiet of Lakeview Estates. To Deborah, it was an invader, a slimy trespasser on her perfect lawn. To the biologists at the wildlife refuge downstream, it was a desperate survivor, one of many endangered amphibians fleeing a drying marsh. The pipe Deborah had ordered cut. Tom Harper's federally contracted lifeline had triggered an ecological chain reaction, and the frogs were only the beginning. As Deborah swatted at the creature with a rolled-up magazine, unaware of the federal storm brewing, Tom stood with Agent Daniel Reed and Dr. Laura Chun, documenting a crisis that was no longer just about a broken pipe. The refuge was in chaos. Without the steady flow from Lake Serenity, the marsh had become a patchwork of cracked mud and wilting reeds. Frogs, hardwired to seek moisture, scattered into residential areas, while migratory birds, deprived of insects, abandoned their nests. Dr. Chun, a soft-spoken biologist with a knack for precision, called it the fastest ecological collapse she'd ever seen. "It's not just the water," she told Tom, pointing to a satellite image of the shrinking marsh. "The insects die, the birds leave, and the whole food chain unravels." She handed him a stack of photos: frogs stranded in culverts, herons circling empty skies, each a testament to Deborah's reckless act. Tom felt the weight of it all. For 5 years, he'd maintained the pipe quietly, a 58-year-old retiree who'd found purpose in protecting creatures most people never noticed. Now, his work was unraveling because of one woman's ego. Agent Reed, scribbling in his notebook, was blunt. "This isn't a misunderstanding," he said. "She knew the pipe was there. We have witnesses, and we're digging deeper." The investigation had escalated, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service treating the incident as a potential criminal violation. Reed's team was now combing through HOA records, looking for proof of Deborah's intent. Back in Lakeview Estates, Deborah was fighting a different battle. She stood in the HOA clubhouse, her teal tracksuit swapped for a tailored blazer, addressing a packed room of neighbors. Her voice was smooth, practiced, as she painted herself as a victim of bureaucracy. "That pipe was a hazard," she insisted, gesturing to a PowerPoint slide of her restored shoreline. "It was abandoned, ugly, and a risk to our property values." Several board members nodded, their loyalty tied to years of Deborah's favors-approved patio extensions, overlooked fence violations. But cracks were forming. Carl, the retired teacher, raised his hand. "Tom sent emails about that pipe years ago," he said. "Why didn't we act?" Deborah's smile tightened, but she deflected, blaming a rogue contractor for the mix-up. Tom sat in the back, arms crossed, letting her talk. He didn't need to argue, not yet. His evidence was airtight: a federal contract, ignored emails, and now a recording of Greg, Deborah's husband, admitting she'd known about the pipe. That morning, a local journalist had called Tom, sniffing a story. By noon, the headline hit: "HOA President's Pipe Cut Sparks Wildlife Crisis." The article included a photo of a frog perched on Deborah's shattered lawn gnome, captioned, "From Marsh to Misery." It went viral, with comments flooding in, some mocking Deborah's arrogance, others decrying HOA overreach. One user wrote, "This is what happens when power goes unchecked. Shame on her." Another countered, "It's her land. Why should she bow to frogs?" The debate raged, splitting readers and fueling shares. Deborah's response was swift but clumsy. She posted on the HOA's Facebook page, claiming she'd been misled by the contractor and was cooperating fully with authorities. But screenshots of her earlier comments dismissing Tom's warnings and joking about government frogs surfaced within hours. Her credibility crumbled. Neighbors who'd once fawned over her garden parties now whispered in driveways, questioning her judgment. A retired couple, both former park rangers, circulated a petition for a special HOA meeting to review her leadership. The tide was turning, and Deborah felt it. That evening, Tom met Dr. Chun at the refuge. where emergency water trucks rumbled in, their hoses feeding temporary tanks. She thanked him for raising the alarm, her voice heavy. "Another 48 hours, and we'd have lost an entire frog generation," she said. "These species, they don't recover easily." Tom nodded, the stakes sinking in. This wasn't just about rules or property lines. It was about lives, fragile and irreplaceable. As they walked the marsh's edge, he noticed a heron standing motionless, its reflection rippling in a shrinking puddle. It felt like a warning. The next day, federal agents arrived at the HOA clubhouse with a search warrant. Deborah, unaware, pulled up in her SUV, her face freezing at the sight of Agent Reed's badge. She stammered that they needed an appointment, but Reed's partner, a woman with a no-nonsense ponytail, cut her off. "The warrant's active. Step aside or we'll charge obstruction." Inside, they pored over digital files and dusty binders, uncovering a gold mine. Unfiled invoices labeled miscellaneous landscaping, including one with Deborah's initials authorizing the trench to remove unsightly piping. It was proof she'd acted deliberately, using HOA funds without board approval. Deborah stood in the doorway, arms crossed, her silence louder than any defense. The discovery shifted the case. What began as a civil dispute now carries criminal weight, potential charges for endangering protected species and misusing community funds. Reed's team photographed the invoices, their flashbulbs casting stark light on Deborah's unraveling empire. Outside, a neighbor snapped a photo of the agent's SUV and posted it to the community forum with the caption, "Trouble at the top." By evening, the post had 200 comments, ranging from outrage to glee. One resident wrote, "She thought she owned the lake. Now the feds own her." Another argued, "This is overkill. It's just a pipe." The split opinions kept the story alive, trending locally and drawing eyes from beyond Lakeview. Deborah's next move was a desperate PR stunt. She hired a local publicist and staged a wildlife rescue on her patio, gently lifting a frog from her flower bed for the cameras. But as she released it, her grip slipped, and the frog sailed into a neighbor's birdbath with a plop. The footage, caught by a bystander, aired on the 6 p.m. news under the headline, "HOA Leader's Frog Fumble." Social media erupted with memes, frogs in hard hats, Deborah tossing amphibians like frisbees. Her attempt to spin the narrative backfired, turning her into a punchline. Yet some neighbors, loyal to her charisma, defended her, claiming the media was unfair. "She made a mistake," one posted. "Why ruin her life over frogs?" The debate grew heated, with comments piling up, each one boosting the story's visibility. Tom, meanwhile, found himself in an unfamiliar spotlight. His inbox filled with message thank yous from wildlife groups, interview requests from reporters, even a crayon drawing from a local kid showing frogs with picket signs reading, "Save our home." He didn't feel like a hero, he felt tired. Years of quiet work had been upended by one woman's arrogance, and the fight was far from over. At a community center event, organized by Dr. Chun to educate residents about the lake's ecosystem, Tom spoke briefly. "Listen to what you don't understand," he said, his voice steady. "Pride shouldn't trump responsibility." The crowd nodded, but everyone knew who he meant. Deborah, absent from the event, was said to have watched from her car, her silhouette visible through tinted windows. Back at home, Tom received a call from Agent Reed. The investigation had uncovered more HOA emails where Deborah dismissed Tom's warnings as tree-hugger nonsense and rallied board members to ignore him. One message, sent to her vice president, read, "Frogs don't pay dues." "We do." Reed's tone was grim. "This shows intent," he said. "She's in deep." The evidence was mounting, but so was Deborah's defiance. She'd hired a lawyer, a slick young man named Ethan, who filed a counterclaim alleging Tom's pipe was unmarked and a community hazard. It was a weak defense, but it bought her time and stoked more debate. Neighbors took sides, some backing Tom's quiet resolve, others swayed by Deborah's charm or distrust of federal overreach. The community forum buzzed, with threads titled "Pipegate" and "Who Owns the Lake," racking up thousands of views. As the week ended, a new development hit. Frogs, driven by instinct, began appearing in more yards, hopping across driveways and patios. One landed in Deborah's hot tub, prompting another shriek heard 3 houses away. To her, it was a personal affront. To the refuge, It was proof of the crisis's scale. Dr. Chen's team worked overtime, relocating amphibians to temporary habitats, but the damage was done. The marsh's collapse was now visible literally in Lakeview's backyards. A local TV crew filmed the frog invasion. Interviewing residents split between sympathy for the creatures and frustration at the disruption. One man, a 62-year-old accountant, said, "I feel for the frogs, but this is on Deborah. She started it." His neighbor, a Deborah loyalist, snapped, "It's Tom's fault for hiding that pipe." The clip went viral, its comment section a battleground of blame and outrage. Tom stood by the lake that night, watching fireflies flicker over the water. The fight had grown bigger than he'd imagined, exposing not just Deborah's arrogance, but the fragility of the world he'd sworn to protect. He thought of the heron in the puddle, the frogs in the tubs, and the neighbors now picking sides. This wasn't just about a pipe, Anna Maria, it was about power, responsibility, and the cost of ignoring consequences. As he turned to head home, his phone buzzed with a text from Reed, "Court date set. Be ready." The storm was coming, and Deborah was running out of umbrellas. The courthouse steps in downtown Lakeview buzzed with anticipation, reporters jostling for angles as cameras tracked every arrival. It was an ordinary Wednesday in upstate New York, but for the residents of Lakeview Estates, it felt like a reckoning. Tom Harper, clutching a folder stuffed with documents, walked through the crowd, his face set with quiet resolve. The hearing today would decide whether Deborah Mitchell's impulsive decision to cut a federal water pipe warranted civil penalties or escalated to criminal charges. Inside, the air was thick with tension, neighbors whispering, some siding with Tom's defense of the ecosystem, others murmuring that Deborah was being unfairly targeted. The story had gone national, with online forums debating property rights versus environmental duty, each post amplifying the drama. As Tom took his seat, he knew one thing. This wasn't just about a pipe, Anna Maria, it was about who would pay for pride's consequences. The past week had been a whirlwind. Deborah's botched PR stunt flinging a frog into a bird bath on live TVAD cemented her as a meme, with hashtags like frog toss and pipegate trending across platforms. Comment sections were a battleground. Some called her a victim of federal overreach, arguing private property should trump obscure wildlife laws. Others branded her a reckless tyrant, endangering lives for a prettier lawn. The split kept the story viral, with YouTube reaction videos racking up views as creators dissected the HOA Karen saga. Yet in Lakeview Estates, the mood was less humorous. Frogs still hopped through backyards, a living reminder of the marsh's collapse, and the wildlife refuge scrambled with emergency measures, their costs climbing into the tens of thousands. Tom had spent days preparing with Agent Daniel Reed and Dr. Laura Chun. Their evidence was ironclad. Photos of the severed pipe, invoices showing Deborah's misuse of HOA funds, and Greg's recorded confession that she'd known the pipe's purpose. Most damning were internal HOA emails, uncovered during the federal search, where Deborah dismissed Tom's warnings with a quip, "Frogs don't vote." Reed had been blunt. "This shows intent," he told Tom. "She's not talking her way out." But Deborah wasn't giving up. She'd hired Ethan Caldwell, a young lawyer with a flashy tie and a knack for spin, who'd filed motions claiming the pipe lacked clear federal markings. It was a flimsy defense, but it sowed enough doubt to keep her supporters vocal. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was electric. Deborah entered through a side door, her beige dress carefully chosen to project innocence, her designer handbag clutched like a shield. She kept her sunglasses on until the clerk's sharp glance forced them off. Ethan sat beside her, flipping through a legal pad, his confidence visibly strained. Across the room, Tom sat with his lawyer, James Whitaker, a reserved man whose calm demeanor hid a ruthless streak. The judge, a silver-haired veteran named Robert Klein, took the bench with a no-nonsense air, his gavel cutting through the murmurs. The hearing opened with an emergency injunction filed by Tom and the Fish and Wildlife Service to block further shoreline alterations by Deborah or the HOA. Ethan stood, arguing the pipe wasn't visibly marked as federal infrastructure, implying Deborah's actions were an honest mistake. Whitaker countered with drone footage showing the pipe's clear markings, blue paint, and a small plaque reading, USFWS property. He presented Tom's contract, emails Deborah had ignored, and Greg's testimony that she'd seen the property plans. Then came the knockout blow, Whitaker produced an HOA email where Deborah wrote, "Frogs don't vote. I'm not letting some pipe ruin my view." The courtroom gasped. Judge Klein blinked, asking the clerk to reread the line. Deborah's face drained of color. Ethan looked like he wanted to vanish. Whitaker wasn't done. He submitted a USB drive with the viral frog toss video, playing it on a courtroom monitor. As Deborah's awkward fling sent the frog splashing into a birdbath, chuckles rippled through the room, not the kind that helped her case. Whitaker noted the stunt was staged to deflect blame, not aid wildlife. He then detailed the financial toll: $32,000 in emergency water trucks and habitat recovery, with costs still rising. The evidence painted a clear picture. Deborah's actions weren't ignorant, they were deliberate, driven by ego and a disregard for consequences. When Tom took the stand, he spoke plainly. He described the pipe's role, how it sustained a fragile ecosystem, and how years of cooperation with the Fish and Wildlife Service had rebuilt frog and heron populations. "This isn't about me or her," he said, glancing at Deborah. "It's about stewardship. Ignoring that to look powerful, it's a choice, and it hurts more than one neighborhood." His words landed heavily, resonating with retirees in the gallery who'd spent decades valuing community over personal gain. Online, clips of his testimony spread, with viewers praising his restraint or debating whether he'd been too soft on Deborah. Deborah's turn came next. She stood, her voice trembling with rehearsed emotion, claiming she'd relied on the contractor's advice and was targeted for her HOA role. "I only wanted to beautify the lake for everyone," she said. A snort from the back row broke her focus, and her eyes flashed with anger. Judge Klein thanked her and called a lunch recess, promising a ruling by afternoon. Outside, the courthouse lawn was a circus. Wildlife activists held signs with cartoon frogs and hard hats, one reading, "Deborah drained our home." A smaller group, HOA loyalists, waved placards defending property rights. Reporters swarmed, their live feeds fueling more online clashes. One commenter wrote, "She deserves jail for endangering species." Another snapped, "It's her land. Feds need to back off." The polarized reactions kept the story trending, each view pushing it higher in YouTube's algorithm. Tom stepped outside for air, his mind racing. A woman in her 60s, wearing hiking boots and a ranger's badge, approached. She introduced herself as Margaret Holt, a regional director for the Department of Natural Resources. "You took on the HOA when no one else would," she said, her voice low. "They've dodged conservation rules for years." She handed him a card, inviting him to speak at an environmental conference. Tom nodded, stunned by how far this had spiraled. The recognition felt strange. He'd only wanted to protect the pipe, not become a figurehead. But the stakes were clear. This fight was bigger than Lakeview Estates. Back inside, Judge Klein returned with his ruling. The court recognized that Deborah and the HOA's unauthorized actions had disrupted a federally protected water system. Deborah was ordered to pay $82,000 in restitution for remediation costs and fines. She was banned from HOA leadership for 5 years, and the shoreline was placed under federal supervision for 2 years, with any interference deemed criminal trespass. The gallery buzzed as Deborah sat frozen, her lips tight, eyes fixed ahead. Ethan scribbled notes, but the defeat was clear. Online, the ruling sparked a fresh wave of reaction: celebration from environmentalists, outrage from property rights advocates. One viral post read, "Justice for the frogs," with thousands of likes, while another, "Feds ruin lives over a pipe," gained traction among Deborah's defenders. As the courtroom cleared, neighbors approached Tom. Some apologized for staying silent. Others offered to help with the cleanup. A few suggested he run for the HOA board, now that Deborah's allies were resigning. Tom didn't commit, just wanted to go home. Driving back to Lakeview, he passed the lake, where a new federal sign stood by Deborah's once pristine lounge area, marking the restoration zone. That evening, a middle school class visited the shoreline, snapping photos of the sign and whispering about the pipe lady. Deborah watched from her kitchen, curtains twitching, her reign as HOA queen reduced to a cautionary tale. The next morning, Tom received a letter from the Fish and Wildlife Service, a formal commendation and an offer to help develop private land conservation programs. It wasn't just about pipes anymore. They wanted his voice, his resolve. The HOA, under pressure, scheduled a board re-election. Deborah's allies quit before the vote, and a new president, a retired engineer named Susan, won overwhelmingly. Her first act was reinstating Tom's lake access and naming the pipe area Serenity Reserve, with a wooden sign showing a frog holding a wrench. The sign's message was simple: "Please don't cut this. It's not just water." Tom smiled, the first time in weeks without a trace of irony. But Deborah wasn't done. She filed an appeal, claiming the fines were excessive and the pipe's markings unclear. Her lawyer argued she'd been scapegoated for an HOA oversight, not personal malice. The move reignited debate, with online forums splitting over whether she deserved a second chance or harsher punishment. Some neighbors, still loyal, hosted a fundraiser for her legal fees, while others, led by Carl, organized a cleanup day to support the refuge. The community was fracturing, each side digging in, their arguments echoing online and driving more views to the saga. Tom met Dr. Chen at the refuge, where frogs were being released into temporary pools. She showed him data. Bird activity was down 30%, and frog populations had dropped by a quarter. "We're stabilizing," she said, "but it'll take years to recover." Tom nodded, the reality grounding him. The courtroom wind felt hollow against the martial scars. As they worked, a local news van pulled up, filming the effort. The reporter asked Tom if he felt vindicated. "It's not about me," he said. "It's about what we owe the world we live in." The clip aired that night, sparking another round of comments: praise for his humility, criticism for his preachy tone. The story wouldn't die, its drama too raw, too divisive. That night, Tom sat on his porch, the lake shimmering under a crescent moon. The fight had exposed fault lines between neighbors, between personal gain and collective good. Deborah's appeal loomed, and the refuge's recovery was fragile. But for the first time, Tom felt the community shifting, not just toward him, but toward something bigger. The question was whether it would last or if Deborah's next move would drag them all back into the mud. The spring sun cast a golden glow over Lake Serenity, but in Lakeview Estates, the warmth couldn't pierce the chill of division. Deborah Mitchell's appeal against her $82,000 fine and HOA ban had reignited the neighborhood's fault lines, with some residents rallying behind her claim of unfair punishment, while others backed Tom Harper's quiet fight for the wildlife refuge. Online, the saga of Pipegate continued to dominate, with YouTube videos dissecting Deborah's courtroom loss and Tom's testimony racking up millions of views. Comment sections buzzed with debates over property rights, environmental responsibility, and the power of HOAs, each post fueling the story's viral spread. As Tom walked the lake's edge, checking the new federal signs marking the Serenity Reserve, he felt the weight of a community teetering between change and chaos. Deborah's next move, a desperate bid to reclaim her status, would push Lakeview to the brink and force Tom to confront the true cost of standing up. The courtroom ruling had left Deborah a pariah, her once pristine backyard now bordered by a federal fence and a sign declaring it a protected zone. Her house, listed for sale, sat untouched, realtors whispering about its complications, a euphemism for the legal and ecological baggage tied to the property. Deborah, once the HOA's unchallenged queen, was rarely seen outside, her patio furniture stacked under a tarp, her garden ornaments dark and sinking into the soil. Yet she hadn't surrendered. Her appeal, filed by her lawyer Ethan Caldwell, argued the fines were excessive and the pipe's federal status unclear, claiming she'd been scapegoated for an HOA oversight. It was a long shot, but it kept her in the fight and kept Lakeview's tensions simmering. Online, the appeal sparked a fresh wave of controversy. Environmentalists celebrated the ruling as a win for accountability, with one viral post reading, "Deborah thought she owned the lake." Nature begged to differ. Property rights advocates, however, rallied to her side, arguing the federal response was overreach. A YouTube channel with 500,000 subscribers posted a video titled, "HOA Hero or Habitat Villain," dissecting the case. Its comment section split between "she endangered species" and "it's her land." The polarized reactions drove engagement, with each view pushing the story higher in YouTube's algorithm. In Lakeview, the debate was personal. A fundraiser for Deborah's legal fees, hosted by a loyalist named Barbara, drew a small but vocal crowd, while a cleanup day for the refuge, led by Carl the retired teacher, saw dozens of neighbors planting reeds and hauling debris. The community was fracturing, each side digging in. Tom, meanwhile, was navigating a new role. The Fish and Wildlife Service's offer to consult on regional water systems had elevated him from pipe caretaker to environmental advocate. He'd accepted, signing on for a stipend and federal clearance. a move that stunned neighbors who'd once seen him as just the guy with the tidy garage. At a community event, a lakeside restoration festival organized by the new HOA president, Susan, Tom watched kids paint frog masks and scientists explain the marsh's recovery. He didn't speak, preferring to let the chatter of children and the croak of returning frogs carry the day. But his presence drew eyes. Neighbors waved. A few dropped off cookies, and one girl left a painted rock by his mailbox with a frog and the words, "Thank you, Tom." The recognition felt heavy. He'd never sought it, but it came anyway. Deborah, absent from the festival, was rumored to have watched from her second-story window, curtains parted just enough to betray her curiosity. Her appeal had hit a snag. Judge Klein rejected her claim about the pipe's markings, citing drone footage and Tom's contract as undeniable proof. But she doubled down, launching a PR campaign to paint herself as a misunderstood homeowner caught in red tape. She gave an interview to a local TV station, her voice quivering with practiced sincerity. "I wanted to protect our community's beauty," she said, dabbing her eyes. "I never meant to hurt anything." The performance swayed some, with a few neighbors posting supportive comments online. But when a viewer leaked an old HOA email where Deborah called the refuge a swamp for losers, the backlash was swift. Memes of her crying face next to frog emojis flooded social media, and her credibility took another hit. The refuge's recovery, meanwhile, was fragile but progressing. Dr. Laura Chin's team had installed temporary pools, and frog populations were stabilizing, though bird activity remained low. She showed Tom a chart. Insect levels were creeping up, a sign the food chain was healing, but full recovery would take years. "Your pipe saved us from worse," she said, her voice warm. "But we're not out of the woods." Tom nodded, the data grounding him. The courtroom win hadn't erased the marshal's scars, and Deborah's appeal threatened to delay repairs further. At the refuge, he helped release a batch of frogs, their tiny legs kicking as they vanished into the reeds. The moment felt right, Wyatt, purposeful, a reminder of why he'd fought. Back in Lakeview, Deborah made a critical mistake. Late one evening, frustrated by her wilting garden, she ran a hose around the federal fence, letting water trickle into a shallow ditch. It wasn't malicious, she just wanted her roses to survive, but it violated the restoration zone's strict rules. A wildlife ranger, patrolling the area, spotted the hose and traced it to her backyard. A report was filed, and a formal warning issued. The incident, small but symbolic, spread through the community forum like wildfire. "She can't even follow basic rules," one resident posted. Another, a Deborah supporter, countered, "It's just water. Leave her alone." The debate reignited, with thousands of views and comments pushing the story back into YouTube's trending tab. Tom heard about the hose incident from Agent Reed, who called to update him on the appeal. "She's digging her own grave," Reed said. The judge sees the pattern: defiance, not ignorance. The warning added a new charge to Deborah's file: minor trespass on federal land, a civil infraction, but enough to weaken her appeal. Reed's team was now auditing her HOA financial records, suspecting more misuse of funds. The net was tightening, and Deborah's allies were dwindling. Barbara's fundraiser fizzled, raising only $2,000, while Carl's cleanup day drew over 50 volunteers, including a local scout troop. The community's mood was shifting, not just against Deborah, but toward a new sense of responsibility. The HOA, under Susan's leadership, was transforming. New policies required transparency in spending, and a permanent environmental committee, with Tom as a member, was tasked with protecting the lake. Some residents grumbled, calling it bureaucratic fluff, but when Susan shared data on the refuge's recovery, frog counts up 15%, parent sightings returning, the complaints faded. Deborah's name was rarely mentioned in meetings, her influence reduced to a whispered warning. What happens when ego overrides sense? Her former board allies had either resigned or been voted out, replaced by pragmatic retirees who valued order over drama. Tom's new role with the Fish and Wildlife Service took him beyond Lakeview. He visited other communities, advising on small-scale water systems, his quiet expertise earning respect. At a regional conference, he stood on a stage, his suit slightly wrinkled, and shared the Lakeview story to a packed auditorium. "It started with a pipe," he said, "but it ended with a choice: protect what matters or chase what shines." The crowd applauded, not just for him, but for the idea that one person's stand could ripple outward. Online, clips of his speech spread, with comments praising his humility or debating whether he'd overstated the crisis. Hero, one wrote. Grandstander, another replied. The split kept the story alive, its emotional pull undeniable. In Lakeview, the lake itself was healing. The new pipe, reinforced with dual insulation and multiple federal signs, pumped water steadily to the refuge. Frogs croaked at dusk, dragonflies skimmed the surface, and herons returned, their silhouettes sharp against the sunset. But the neighborhood bore scars not in the land, but in its trust. Neighbors who'd once shared coffee now avoided eye contact, their loyalties tested by the saga. Deborah's house remained unsold, its lakefront listing a hollow boast. She'd tried to challenge the Restoration Zone's zoning, filing a complaint with the county, but the Fish and Wildlife Service's documentation was airtight. The area was protected for 5 years, no alterations, no exceptions. One evening, Tom sat with Reed on his porch, the agent now in jeans, sipping gas station coffee. The federal investigation was wrapping up, with monitoring in place to ensure the refuge's recovery. Reed handed Tom a letter from the Department of the Interior, formalizing his consulting role. "You're not just the pipe guy anymore," Reed said, a rare smile breaking through. Tom laughed, but the weight of it lingered. He'd never wanted to be a symbol, but the fight had made him one. As Reed left, Tom looked at the lake, its surface calm but carrying the memory of chaos. Deborah's appeal hearing loomed, and while her chances were slim, her defiance was a wild card. The community had changed, but could it hold together? The summer sun hung low over Lake Serenity, painting the water with streaks of gold as dragonflies danced across its surface. In Lakeview Estates, the scars of the past year were fading, but the memory of the Pipegate saga lingered like a shadow. Tom Harper stood by the Serenity Reserve, the federal sign now joined by a wooden plaque etched with a frog and a wrench, a quiet testament to the fight that had reshaped the community. Deborah Mitchell's appeal hearing was days away, her last chance to overturn the $82,000 fine and HOA ban that had stripped her of power. Online, the story still burned bright, with YouTube videos and Reddit threads dissecting every twist, from Deborah's frog toss fiasco to Tom's courtroom stand. Comments poured in, split between those cheering the triumph of environmental justice and others decrying federal overreach. As Tom checked the pipe's pressure gauge, he felt a rare peace, not because the fight was over, but because Lakeview had chosen a new path. Yet Deborah's final act would test that fragile harmony, forcing the neighborhood to confront its values one last time. The appeal hearing had become a spectacle, with local news vans parked outside the courthouse and activists on both sides waving signs. Environmentalists held banners reading "Protect Our Marsh," while a smaller group of Deborah's supporters brandished placards proclaiming "Property Rights Matter." The online frenzy was relentless, with a YouTube video titled "The Final Pipe Battle," garnering 1.2 million views in 48 hours. Its comment section was a war zone. Deborah's arrogance ruined lives, versus Tom's pipe obsession cost her everything. The polarized debate kept the story trending, each click fueling its algorithmic rise. In Lakeview Estates, neighbors gathered in living rooms, some hoping for closure, others bracing for more drama. Deborah arrived at the courthouse in a navy blazer, her face composed but her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Her lawyer, Ethan Caldwell, had pivoted to a new strategy, arguing that the HOA's collective negligence, not Deborah's actions, caused the crisis. It was a desperate attempt to shift blame, but it gained traction among her loyalists, who posted online that the board had ignored Tom's warnings for years. Tom, sitting across the courtroom with his lawyer James Whitaker, remained calm. His folder held the same damning evidence: invoices, emails, and Greg's recorded confession that Deborah knew the pipe's purpose. Agent Daniel Reed and Dr. Laura Chun sat behind him, ready to testify about the ecological toll. The stakes were clear. If Deborah won, the fines could be reduced, delaying the refuge's recovery. If she lost, her fall would be complete. Judge Robert Klein took the bench, his expression weary but firm. Ethan opened with a passionate plea, claiming Deborah was a scapegoat for an HOA that failed to regulate the pipe. He pointed to the board minutes, showing no formal response to Tom's emails, suggesting shared fault. It was a clever angle, but Whitaker dismantled it methodically. He presented the HOA email where Deborah wrote, "Frogs don't vote," proving she'd acted with intent. He called Dr. Chun, who detailed the crisis. 25% of the frog population lost, bird activity down 30%, and $100,000 in recovery costs. This wasn't negligence, she said. It was a choice. Reed followed, outlining the federal investigation, including the hose incident that added a trespass charge. The evidence was overwhelming, and Ethan's arguments crumbled. When Deborah spoke, her voice cracked, no longer rehearsed. I didn't mean to hurt anything, she said. I just wanted our lake to be beautiful. The plea fell flat, overshadowed by her documented defiance. Judge Klein recessed briefly, returning with a ruling that silenced the room. The appeal was denied. The $82,000 fine stood, the HOA ban was upheld, and Deborah was ordered to pay an additional $5,000 for the trespass violation. The restoration zone would remain under federal control for 5 years, with stricter monitoring. Actions have consequences, Klein said, his gaze fixed on Deborah. You chose pride over responsibility. The gallery buzzed, and online, the ruling sparked a firestorm celebration from environmentalists, outrage from Deborah's defenders. One comment read, "Justice served." Another snapped, "Feds crushed a homeowner." The split drove millions more views. Deborah left the courthouse without a word, her face pale, her handbag clutched like a lifeline. Her supporters dwindled, and even Barbara, her staunchest ally, stayed silent. The HOA, now led by Susan, moved swiftly to distance itself. A new policy mandated environmental training for board members, and the Serenity Reserve was declared a permanent protected area. Susan invited Tom to unveil a second sign, this one reading, "Guardians of Serenity," in honor of community stewardship. Neighbors applauded, and a local paper ran a story titled, "The Man Who Saved the Marsh," quoting Tom's courtroom line. The smallest creatures remind us how big our responsibilities are. The article went viral, its comment section a mix of praise and skepticism, keeping the saga alive. The refuge was healing. Dr. Chin's latest report showed frog populations up 20%, with herons nesting again. Insects buzzed over the marsh, and the food chain was knitting itself back together. Tom visited weekly, helping with water tests and frog releases. One evening, knee-deep in the marsh, he watched a frog leap from his hand into the reeds, its tiny splash a quiet victory. "We're getting there," Chin said, smiling. The moment felt like closure not just for the refuge, but for Tom, who'd carried the fight's weight for over a year. Online, clips of the release aired on a wildlife channel, with viewers posting heart emojis and calls to protect our lakes. The positive spin boosted the story's reach, its emotional pull undeniable. In Lakeview Estates, the community was rebuilding. The HOA's new transparency rules restored trust, and the Environmental Committee, with Tom's input, launched a lake education program for residents. Kids from the middle school joined, painting frog murals and learning about ecosystems. Neighbors who'd once clashed over Deborah's fundraisers now worked together on cleanups, their shared purpose healing old rifts. Carl, the retired teacher, started a blog chronicling the refuge's recovery, its posts shared widely, and adding to the story's online legacy. The neighborhood felt differentless about status, more about connection. Deborah's house finally sold, but not to a retiree seeking lakefront bliss. A conservation group bought it at a discount, planning to use it as an education center for the refuge. The irony was sharp. Her prized patio would now host school groups studying the frogs she'd dismissed. Deborah moved to a condo 30 miles away. Her departure was quiet but noticed. A few neighbors speculated she'd return, but most believed she'd learned her lesson. Her name became a cautionary tale, whispered at HOA meetings, "Don't pull a Deborah." Online, her memes faded, replaced by frog-themed conservation campaigns that kept the story's core message alive. Tom's life had changed. His consulting role with the Fish and Wildlife Service took him across the region, advising on water systems and speaking at conferences. He was nominated for a National Conservation Award, standing on a stage in a borrowed suit as a crowd of scientists and officials applauded. "This started with a pipe," he said, "but it ended with us choosing what matters." The speech, posted online, drew thousands of comments, from inspiring to too idealistic. The debate kept the story relevant, its lessons resonating beyond Lakeview. One morning, Tom received a package from the refugee, a framed photo of the marsh, vibrant with frogs and herons, signed by Chen's team with the words, "To the Pipe Guardian." He hung it in his garage, next to the pressure gauges he still checked weekly. The lake, now a symbol of resilience, hummed with life. Frogs croaked, birds soared, and the Serenity Reserve stood as a reminder of what was possible when one person refused to back down. Neighbors waved as Tom walked by, their smiles genuine, their community stronger for the fight. The saga of Pipegate had left its mark not just on Lakeview Estates, but on the millions who'd followed it online. It was a story of power abused and reclaimed, of nature's fragility and humanity's choice to protect it. Tom didn't see himself as a hero, but as a man who'd done what was right, even when it was hard. As he stood by the lake, watching the sunset ripple across the water, he knew the fight had been worth it. The pipe, the frogs, the community feed all survived, and that was enough. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What do you think about the power dynamics in this story? Did Deborah deserve her punishment, or was the system too harsh? How do you view the balance between personal rights and collective responsibility in cases like this? Share your perspective on power and injustice in everyday life, and let's get the conversation going.